sort of be here anyway. I like to see faces when I can, but when I can't, I can pretend you're all smiling. So that's good. So I'll live with that fantasy for as long as I can. This topic actually came up to me back about 4 or 5 years ago, and I still am active as a freelance designer, and I designed professionally for nearly 20 years before starting to teach. And I noticed that a lot of my clients were retired, and they had big aspirations and asked for a lot and were gung-ho to care for it themselves. And when you're in the industry for that long and you know, in one locality, it was easy to see that toward the end of my career, that latter part of the 20 years, a lot of those gardens were falling into a little bit of disarray. And there was some frustration with a lot of my clients in that the frustration was not in their landscape, but was in their ability to manage. And so that kind of was the, I guess, the genesis of this discussion, because I've been asked more times than I can count for lower maintenance landscape design. And so
never could figure it out.
What's that?
And so with that being said, I'm not sure they could have done anything anyway.
Absolutely, right, yes. So we're going to get started here. Today we are going to look at...
anyway, all right, I'm going to the post.
I've got a little bit of a timeline that we'll start here. We'll start with birth. That's where most of us get started anyway. And so then from there, we're in our youth, right? And part of this, I got to tell you, is up to a point anyway, is mirroring my timeline. So when I was younger, I helped my parents and grandparents in the garden. Sometimes I enjoyed it, sometimes I didn't, but it really wasn't an option for me at that time. Many of you probably grew up the same way that I did, and that was that children were also farmhands, and so it worked really well for our parents. And actually, as it turned out, even those experiences that were a little less than enjoyable, I tend to miss now as I'm aging. And not in that life. And then from there, we're in our teens and maybe into our 20s. A lot of us, I'm lucky enough to be on campus and see teens and 20s that are interested in gardening and landscaping, but that doesn't seem to be the majority. And so the desire to garden diminishes just a little bit. And then we hit our 30s, and this is where, like my daughter says, people start adulting a little bit. They get their own place, they start a family, they get a little nostalgic for the gardening that they did with their parents when they were younger. They work some in their own yard and garden, and then might try growing their own food for a little while. I found that the edible gardens are a great way to get people started back into gardening. And then from there, you're into your 40s. You're active, very active. You have kids that are active, and that forces you to be active. And you have mortgages and you have bills. You have college funds that you have to contribute to. You have a job that takes up the majority of your time. And there just seems to be no time to garden. And your garden starts to look like maybe mine did in my 40s. And that was a place where there used to be plants growing. Now there are advantageous plants growing. The weeds were in there. And so, without the time sufficient enough to maintain it, you just kind of give up for a little while. And then in the 50s, which I'm knocking on that door now as I speak, and your kids start leaving home. You get to be a little less active, maybe. Some of the bills are a little less of a burden. You have a little bit more time. And so you start resuming your activities in the garden. And then you start saying things to yourself like, I'm really going to make this space sweet when I retire. That retirement is what I'm looking forward to have all that time to make my landscape a show place, And then we move into our 60s. Maybe we retire. Hopefully you retire, right? Gardening full-time. Your hobby has become your passion. Creating my paradise is what you're working on, and your knees, maybe hips, starting to hurt a little bit more. You might get winded a little more easily, but the place looks great, and you're excited to show it off to your friends and fellow master gardeners, right? But then the 70s, and those knees and hips, maybe even the heart, needs a little work. Maybe you've got a knee replacement, hip replacement. Maybe your heart valve has been replaced. You can't quite get out there as much as you used to. Maybe I should hire someone, right? And then we get into our 80s, place is looking rough. Can't afford to pay for the help. My kids and grandkids would love to help, but I hate to ask because they are just so busy. And then there you go. That's a happy thought right there, or at least it's no longer my problem, right? So that is the life of a gardener. And I hate to start off on such a, kind of a downer note, but that's kind of the facts of life. The reality there is we move from not into gardening back into not into gardening, or maybe even part of the garden. I don't know how you work there, but one of the ways that you can help yourself is to try to avoid biting off more than you can chew, okay? That's like this kid right here. We need to keep future maintenance requirements in mind when planning our gardens. Maintenance is crucial to the longevity of any landscape. I have been asked many times as a designer to develop that zero landscape design, and I have not yet been able to succeed in that. But if you want your picture perfect entrance or your fantastic backyard to continue looking so, you have to do some work to take care of it. Landscape maintenance can be costly and or time consuming. And actually that's typically why it is costly, is because it is time consuming. When I was working with Rost Incorporated here in the Columbia area, one of our most lucrative divisions was our landscape management, our landscape maintenance division. And that's because they were willing to do what others either couldn't or didn't have time to do and would pay us for. And so it was, again, I saw the bills going out and I saw the revenue coming in. So I know how expensive maintenance can be to have other people do it. As we age, our skills decrease. And maybe not our skills so much as our ability, our limitations increase, right? So we still know what we should do. We still know how to do it, but it's just harder to do it as long as we once did. And that's, kind of what this conversation started from. We have to weigh our benefit versus cost and plan accordingly. And I'm not talking necessarily about the financial cost. When we are making decisions about what we do with our garden, when we're making decisions about how we landscape, how much garden space we want to take on, we have to look at the benefit that we receive from that garden and the input that's going to have to go into it. And that's not necessarily, like I said, not necessarily financial, but it's also physical, it's also time. And so you have to plan accordingly with what you are willing to do for the benefit that you receive. Now I, Moloney, always design with maintenance in mind, even when it's not requested. However, it is the #1 request from a client, bar none. From my clients anyway. They have very creative ways of telling me about their personal maintenance skills. They tell me things like, I have 10 brown thumbs. I've heard that one. I've also heard I can kill silk plants. Heard that. I've also heard I do not wish to be married to my landscape. I can understand that. And so these little hints that are given along, and plus people will come right out and ask you for that low maintenance design. Second, I realized that not everybody out there have the same skills that master gardeners do, or that I do, that people that are familiar with plants. Their maintenance abilities are traditionally low. Being immersed in the plant world for my entire life, I find I'm sometimes still amazed at how little folks know about plants. We used to, I got a call one time about some maple trees that we had planted in the spring of the year for one of our clients, and they were concerned because it was now in October, late October, and they were concerned because the maple tree's leaves turned from green to orange and then brown and then fell off. And they were concerned that that tree had died, and they were asking for replacements. And that definitely caught me off guard. At first I thought the young lady was joking, but then I realized she didn't understand that all these plants, not all the plants keep their leaves all winter long. And so I bit my tongue and tried not to laugh and explain that to her. So again, but that's okay, because, you know, there's things that I would like to know more about and I have to hire people for. And so I wouldn't have a job if everybody knew everything about this. Professional maintenance is not inexpensive. It costs a lot. I grew up on a farm and we didn't pay anyone else to do anything. If I have to pay somebody to mow my lawn, I feel like I failed. That's where I'm at. If I have to call a plumber, I feel like I failed. That's just my mindset. And so I try to design landscapes for people that are not a burden, or at least not more of a burden. The longevity and appearance of the landscapes that I design is crucial. Okay, I need the work that I'm doing now to get people excited enough to recommend me to their friends, and I get new clients that way. And so, maintenance is required to keep those landscapes looking good, so that I have the, I am confident to be able to tell somebody that's interested to drive by so-and-so's yard, because it still looks great because they take good care of it. And then personally, I love to garden. I absolutely love to garden, but I do not like unnecessary maintenance. I love gardening because I want to. I hate gardening because I have to. There are just some of those tasks that you just don't like to do because it's a have to. If I get up in the morning and it's a beautiful day and I want to go out into the yard and pull a weed here or there, I'm excited about that. But if I drive into my driveway and I realized that I've gone several weeks without pulling a weed, and I now have to see any of the plants that I wanted to be there, then it becomes a have to, and I'm not a big fan of that. And so those all go into play. This thought process of mine always goes into play when I'm designing a landscape for somebody. And by keeping their maintenance low, I can prolong their enjoyment of the space. Okay, I'm not high maintenance, but rather precious cargo with lavish instruction for upkeep. I love that. High maintenance is a system which requires a higher degree of work to ensure proper appearance and function. And both appearance and function come into play, but I think it's the appearance that we notice first, and especially in the garden world. So if we have a high maintenance landscape or garden, then we end up noticing it looking bad before it starts not working well, okay? Landscapes and their nature, and this is where the ability for me to design a zero maintenance landscape, it becomes evident. We're working with living medium, okay? This is an art form that has paints that are alive, let's put it that way. And because what we're working with is alive, it has needs, okay? We have nutritional needs. We have pest control issues. Anything that is alive likes to be eaten by other things that are alive. Weed control, irrigation, pruning, mowing, trimming, edging, transplanting and replanting. All of these activities, and you can see some of these illustrated here. This was the staff that I worked with when I was in the professional part of the industry. And these folks worked hard every day, and people paid them to do so they didn't have to do it themselves. Okay? But all of this is necessary if we want to keep up the appearance of our landscape. So get into the meat of it now, right? How do we reduce? Okay, so let's start with our nutritional concerns or fertilizer first, okay? For one, we don't want to overcrowd our plant material. And one of the simplest ways to do that is to plan for the eventual size. When we are planting, we get into this situation where we go to the garden center and there are these cute little plants. And they're tiny, right? They're in these little containers. You can put 5, 6, 17 of them in your car or truck, and you can go home and you can find a spot for these little plants in our garden. But what we tend to forget when we're buying is how big these plants grow, okay? And so if we don't take into account their mature size when we're installing, we can end up with a bit too many hogs at the trough. And that's basically what we're talking about. Too many plants in one area creates a nutritional concern. Okay? We want to choose soil tolerant plant material with lower nutritional needs. Check out those tags on the back, right? Take a look at them and see what kind of soil requirements they have. One of the issues that we look at here where I'm from, we have a high limestone, lime content in our soils. And so acid loving plants require extra work. We have to work with our soils and amend those to get that organic matter up and get that pH down in there. And so just by using plants that, woody stem plants, the trees, the shrubs, those tend to be a little less picky about the soil that they're planted in because their life cycle is slower. They don't have to worry about producing their flowers and their seeds all in one season. And so they live there longer, they take longer to grow, and they use less nutrition in doing so. Plus the roots go deeper, all right? Utilize large, deep planting beds with adequate organic matter and mulch. Create an environment that is rich in what the plant needs before planting, and then make sure that you keep up with that as time goes on. Plant material and proper exposures. And this one throws folks off sometimes. If you plant, you see in that upper right there, there's a picture of a hydrangea that is wilting in too much sun. And then in the lower left, we have an illustration of what a holly does in too much shade. Okay, and so what we're looking at here is in both cases, it's the remedy that causes some issues here. For instance, what are we going to do when we see that wilted hydrangea? Okay, we're going to water it. And when we water our gardens, we dissolve the nutrients that are in the soil and they are taken up by the plants. So the more we water the plants, the more dilute we are making the environment within which they're planted. Okay, so we're taking the nutrients out of the soil by trying to provide more water for the plant that is suffering because it should have actually been placed in a more moist and shady environment to start with. When we have a plant that should have more sun and we plant it in too deep a shade, that plant has a tendency to elongate. Okay, it elongates to try to reach out to try to find the light that is available. And whenever a plant grows, it utilizes the nutrition that's available. Okay, and so by causing that rapid elongation, we have lessened the amount of nutrients available to the plant. Also, when plants start to get leggy and elongate, we have a tendency to cut off parts of the plant, right, to promote thicker, fuller plants. And every time we prune something away from a plant, we are also cutting away valuable nutrients. Okay? And then it's going to feel like a little bit that I'm villainizing lawns when I talk about lower maintenance, but I'm not. I actually I'm a big fan of the way a green lawn can look in the landscape. I like the way that it can set off the other plantings that we've designed in. I like how we can use the empty negative space of the nice green lawn to draw our eye to the front door or to a focal feature in our landscape. But the fact of the matter is, lawns are nutrient hogs, okay? And to stay in that green lawn club, we tend to pump a lot of water and nutrients to them to make sure that they look the way they're supposed to look all the way through the season, all right? And then we can talk about switching to natives. There's a lot of false advertising about native plants. And when I say that, I think a lot of people get the idea that these are plants that you can just pop in the ground and walk away, but they do have horticultural needs. But this is one thing that I'm 100% on board with, and that is if you use plants that are native to your area, typically they do well in the soils that are there. Now, the one caution that I have on here is make sure you still have native soils. Most times when we build our homes, the soil that was once there is no longer there. And so that does come into play a little bit. But for the most part, you can count on your native variety of plants to do well in your environment without a lot of extra care. Okay? All right, so now let's move from, you know, reduction of nutrients into a reduction of the need for pest control. Okay, pest control, and I'm going, you know, honestly, we could have a 2-day conversation about each individual pest and what they can do. So I'm broadening the scope here of the umbrella of pest. So the umbrella of pest for today's conversation is going to go for everything from viruses and fungus all the way up to deer. Okay, so these are all, we're going to classify all of these as garden pests. So from mammals to insects to the microscopic, these are all pests that we have to deal with in the landscape. And so one of the things that we want to start by, if we're simplifying, is look to see if we can find resistant plant material, you know. And what's really amazing is the amount of, you know, we have right here, you can see my phone, we have at the palm of our hand, in the palm of our hand today, more information that was ever available to gardeners in the past. You know, if I, honestly, if I'm out and about and I have my phone with me, I can pretty much answer any question that I don't know from the top of my head with a quick Google search, right? Okay, so it's there. So what's available to us are lists. And I love these lists. There are people that have worked really hard to put these lists together of resistant plant material. We have virus resistant roses. We have fungal resistant fruit trees. We have deer resistant plants. We have insect resistance. So the only thing that I'll say is resistance does not mean immune, right? Resistance does not mean proof. It may be deer resistant, but it's not necessarily deer proof, okay? But it hedges your bet. Choosing to work with plants that are already resistant to whatever pests you are fighting gives you a leg up as a gardener, okay? You know that that's at least something, at least your fight will be easier, okay? Let's put it that way. And then utilizing companion plants. And again, this takes a little research on the part of the gardener, but you know, I've always been amazed that, you know, when I was little, I had a hard time. I didn't understand why grandma always put the marigolds in with the vegetable gardens. Couldn't understand why marigolds went in with the vegetable gardens. We had flower gardens. We don't put vegetables in our flower gardens, at least we didn't then, right? And so why is she putting flowers in the vegetable garden? Well, it wasn't until I was much older and a little bit wiser that I realized that marigolds are a fantastic companion plant as a natural insecticide, or not insecticide, but they kind of sort of ward off a lot of insect invaders, okay? And then a lot of times you'll see in that upper right picture there where we have an allium growing up in with the roses. And I think, you know, that's a deer thing. Deer absolutely love rosebuds. Trust me, I've tried my hand at a rose garden far too many times and failed because of deer every time. And so the planting of allium, which is not one of a deer's favorite plants, in amongst the roses helps to kind of keep them off of your roses. I've also used daffodils in conjunction with daylilies. You know, daylilies are a treat to a lot of the deer, whereas daffodils actually have a horrible taste and deer won't eat them. So if you can plant the daylilies in with your, you know, or daffodil bulbs in with your daylilies, you know, they come up and bloom early and you have to leave that foliage anyway. So then when the deer come in to take a bite out of your daylily and maybe get a mouthful of daffodil, they might start leaving your daylilies alone. So that's, you know, a way to use companion plants. Utilize material that encourages natural enemies. And yes, this is tongue in cheek. I don't know of any plants that draw in pumas or mountain lions to help ward off the deer. So, but we do have the ability to bring in birds. Okay, so we can plant material that draws birds in, and then the birds do a fantastic job of keeping down your insects. And there are a lot of, I've developed a lot of bird gardens for folks who just like birds. And so one of the things that's a side benefit of having a bird garden is you have fewer insect issues as well. Okay.
Tim, I have a question about a very popular pest that everybody always asks about. What do you do about squirrels?
I'm still trying to figure that out. Thank you. The squirrels are a big issue. I have squirrels that not only are they bothering the plants that I put in, but they're also planting plants that I don't want in my landscape beds because of the softer soils. A couple of things that you can do. One is don't feed them. You know, a lot of times people think that if you feed squirrels away from your garden, that's where they're going to stay. However, the squirrels will eat what, you know, if you get behind on putting your corn out, they're going to come in and bother the rest of your garden. As far as anything else goes, I'm unaware. I really am. I want to say 22, and a lawn chair and a 22 might help, but not a lot of people find that humorous. So we'll just leave it at that go. But you know, I'm opening it up to the room. If anybody else has any ideas about what to do with squirrels, I fight it all the time.
So something that I read online and did last year is I bought red pepper flakes and would just sprinkle them on the ground in those areas, and then it would work for a while.
Yes.
Until it rained, and then
Right.
they'd come back. So it didn't seem to harm any of my plants, and I'm not saying it was necessarily the cheapest, but it was a temporary deterrent.
Sure. Actually, we've also used that with deer before too. Pepper spray actually works. You can dilute that in water, but again, it's temporary. And then I think actually my deer anyway developed I guess an affinity for spicy food. I don't know. They would actually eat it even right after I sprayed it. So I think it's something that once they realize it doesn't hurt them, it is, like you said, a temporary fix on there. The other thing, I've also found that my clients that have outside dogs have a tendency to have less issues with squirrels. And if nothing else, it's just because a dog makes a game out of chasing them out of the yard, even if it never catches them. So there is a little bit of that. And on that same line, I've heard that dog hair can have an effect. The only issue that I have with that is I don't really want to mulch my plants with dog hair. And so that comes into play as well. So good question. I like that. Next up, we're also going to talk about material and proper exposures again. And this is a case where it's a matter of resistance, actually, is what it boils down to. You know, when I was little, my grandma said, "Don't go out in the cold; you'll catch pneumonia." Well, that's not actually true. The pneumonia isn't out in the cold. What happens though is, you know, you lower your resistance. If you're not in optimal conditions, our resistance is lowered, and that's actually what happens a lot of times with our plant material as well. Okay, so we put our plants in a situation where they don't thrive. We put our plants in a situation where they struggle. We put our plants in a situation where they are stressed. Okay, so once they are stressing, then their resistance is low. And so then the borers that you see in this picture, this is a maple tree with sun scald and borer damage. And what happens here is that while the borers are present even in live and healthy maples, the maples have a tendency to overcome it better. And so that is what any kind of pathogen, viruses, fungus, plants can ward these off on their own many times, as long as they are healthy. And so by putting a plant where it should go, rather than trying to force it into something where we want it to go, will be actually help build the resistance up for the plant and help them overcome a lot of the pests that we deal with. Can also, once again, looking at reducing lawn areas. Now I'm over here in Missouri, and I think we need to be the patron saint of garden fungus, because if there is a fungal pathogen that grows in the world, I think it grows in Missouri. And then it doesn't matter, but lawns have a tendency, with our dollar spot and our brown patch and our also the grubs, we just have a lot of issues with lawn pests, moles, voles, grubs, and a lot of these are tied together. You can actually help if you start controlling your grubs. You can actually also control your moles to some extent. And I actually sat in on a garden conversation just earlier this week where one lady was allowing the moles to continue to tear up her yard because she was certain that they were killing the Japanese beetle grubs, eating the Japanese beetle grubs. And she says, I despise the Japanese beetles more than I despise the moles. And so, you know, she's allowing the moles to continue so they get rid of the grubs. And one of the biggest issues I have with control of grubs is that it also takes out beneficials. You know, earthworms are also affected by a lot of the chemical control for grubs. And so you run into that. Fungal issues, you know, so basically just by reducing the area of lawn, and again, I'm not a lawn hater, but by reducing the area that we have in lawn, then we make it maybe a more manageable size to help fight off all these pests that attack our lawns. And again, natives, okay? Now, when we're talking about natives, it's an automatic. Natives have developed to live in an area with the pests that are common in that area, okay? You'll find a lot of Missouri natives that are deer resistant, you know, and that's because deer and Missouri natives have cohabited for tens of thousands of years. What we don't take into account, however, are the non-native invaders, okay? And we run into this quite a bit. The Japanese beetle, not a native, likes a lot of our natives. As a matter of fact, I have it's a rave or some sort of a mass party of Japanese beetle every year in my river birch canopy. The river birch are a native plant, but the Japanese beetle loves that every bit as much as they do my non-native roses. So it's a fight, but we run into an issue a lot. But even by planting our native plants, what we've done is we've eliminated the native pests, okay? They're fungal resistant, you know, for common funguses in that area. They are fungi, I should say, in that area. And they're resistant to insects that are common in the area. They're resistant to the mammals that are common in that area. However, and when we bring in our non-native pests, then we have issues with our natives as well. So keep that in mind. Oh, and back to the Japanese beetle one. It's like a lot of times people, and I'll preempt this question if it's out there. A lot of people ask me, spray or traps? Do you spray the Japanese beetles or do you trap them? And I'm going to say both, okay? What you do is you put your traps up in the neighbor's yard, right? So you put the traps up, draw the Japanese beetles over there, and then spray the ones in your yard, okay? What we found is that the traps work fantastic at capturing Japanese beetles. However, they also work fantastic at drawing them in. So you might have more Japanese beetles with the traps than you would have had without them. Okay.
So I have a quick question. Is that the same for stink bugs?
As far as the traps go?
Yeah.
Yes,
Okay.
it is actually. The traps typically use pheromones. They're typically a pheromone trap. And so it's kind of like me putting on cologne when I was younger going out, right? So it's trying to get that scent to draw the insects in. And so they've captured that pheromone scent, put it in a trap, and that draws the insects into those traps. So yes, it does. It definitely captures the ones that are there, but it may also bring ones in from away.
Tim, we have a couple of questions about the natives.
Yes.
The first one is, any ideas for controlling the self-seeding natives? Like Amsonia is the example.
Yes.
And the other question is, do you fertilize native plants?
Okay, so I'll start with the self-seeding first. Actually, I'm a big fan of the Amsonia. I have it in a lot more places than I planted it. Okay, so that means I'm well aware of the self-seeding of that. And yes, actually, the best method for controlling self-seeding is deadheading. So right as the flowers are spent, before they turn into seeds, remove those spent flowers. Now with something like Amsonia, that's a pretty mundane, monotonous, long-lasting task, but you can actually shear a lot of that off and pick up the clippings, you know, and it won't hurt the plant. But what you're trying to prevent by deadheading is the formation of seeds. So if you can deadhead your plants before the flowers turn into seeds, you're in great shape on that. But again, that is maintenance. So it is maintenance that has to be done on that. Avoiding planting plants that are voracious self-seeders is probably the first start and that, but then you're taking out so many wonderful plants that, you know, it's kind of hard to do. Now, along those lines, kind of a backstory, natives, you know, a lot of times people say plant natives, not invasives. So then the next question is, what about the native invasives? Because that's what we have going on with a lot of self-seeding plants. So just because something is native does not mean it won't take over your world. Okay. And then the other question about, do I fertilize my natives? I do not, actually, I do not. But most of the native plants that I have I actually don't fertilize woody stem plants. I'll go one step beyond. I haven't put any supplemental fertilization into any of my woody stem plants, and most of my landscape is woody stemmed. I have some pockets of herbaceous natives like Amsonia. I've got some Echinacea, and some Rudbeckia, but those have all been selected because of their soil tolerance and lack of need for a lot of supplemental nutrients. And so I don't do a lot of fertilization with my natives, but I did before they were established. Every plant, when you're planting them, have horticultural needs, and if your soil doesn't have everything that the plant needs, you need to make sure that you supplement. Early on, I did supplement, I did fertilize, but once everything was established and coming back regularly, I haven't fertilized my landscape in 10 years. Now the lawn's another story, but the landscape, the plantings haven't been fertilized in 10 years. In fact, I was cleaning out my garden shed and found an old bag of garden fertilizer that was, I don't know what you call it now. It is definitely well past its prime and it's ready to, I don't even know what, does anybody know what to do with out of date old fertilizer? I hate to like toss it in a landfill, but if anybody knows that, chat that in, so.
If you have a hazardous waste site, it might go there.
Okay, thank you, appreciate that. We do have one of those. All right, so weed control. Notice there, I'm still a fan of mulch. And I know that in recent years, mulching and organic mulch has kind of taken a hit in the garden world as being maintenance intense. It also has some issues with nitrogen lock as far as nutrition goes. But I still think the benefits, to me personally, outweigh the downsides when it comes to mulching. I like mulch as a weed preventative. I really do. I also like it for the as a way to keep our moisture levels up in the garden. So I like that quite a bit. Now, we talk also about living ground covers. It's a fantastic method for keeping weeds low. Plant communities have also come into play lately. The one thing that I'm a big fan of plant communities. I love the plant layers. I like the ground cover layer and then the intermediate layer and the skeletal layers. And I love the thought of plants living with plants. I think that's fantastic. But I'm not 100% sold yet on it being a maintenance reduction practice. And I'm waiting for time to tell on that. And again, it's going to come down to our tolerances. What do we want that landscape to look like? You know, because like for instance, in this picture right here, this is actually a liriope ground cover. It's not a native ground cover, but it's a liriope ground cover underneath a wooded tree canopy. And by using living ground covers, we're looking at competition. Competition is what keeps the weeds out, okay? So as long as you have vigorous competition, it's an excellent method for reduction of weed growth. However, when you have gaps or when you have areas that the ground cover is not quite as vigorous, then you have opportunities for weeds. And all weeds are, right, is unwanted plants, right? That's all they are. Weeds don't know they're weeds. All they know is that you prepared this fantastic planting environment and they want to grow there too, okay? And what I have found with the living ground covers and with the plant communities is we're also creating a situation where removal of those weeds that do manage to come up is a little bit more difficult. We're obviously not going to spray, right? I'm not going to go in with an herbicide and spray in amongst a living plant community or living ground cover for fear of damaging the desired plants that are there. Also, I found that it is hard to get to plants that you know, it's hard to find places to put my knees and my feet when I'm walking through an area like this to try to, I call it digital control, right? Digital control of, we're using our digits to control the weeds, getting in there and pulling them out. And so, you know, I say, you know, I'm a big fan of living ground covers. I'm a huge fan of plant communities. I think the concept is fantastic. Just be careful that you're not creating a situation that may be detrimental over time. And by detrimental, I mean harder on you as the gardener, you know, to maintain this. Because if this area in this picture right here is allowed to, you know, get out of control, I'm afraid it's a larger mess than what they would have had without any ground cover in there. And then mulch, again, and that's kind of tongue in cheek, but I am a huge fan of organic mulch. Now, what I'm not a fan of is weed control fabric. I am not a fan of weed control fabric. I use the hate word on there because I do actually despise weed control fabric. And this comes from a long time of working management and working maintenance and ripping out old weed control fabric. You know, they've been engineered to allow more air and more water to the plants, but it's still not as, you know, it's still a barrier. It's still a barrier to healthy plant growth. Also, I will not use weed control fabric underneath an organic mulch. If the mulch is organic, I will not use weed control fabric under it. And that is because organic mulch will decompose on top of that fabric and can create an environment which will promote roots to grow into that decomposed mulch and not grow underneath the fabric. I have gone into a landscape renovation that had weed control fabric and found the roots were all in a 4 to 6 inch layer on top of a weed control fabric. And the roots that were below that fabric had rotted away or not grown. Okay, so it's actually detrimental with an organic mulch. Now, unfortunately, with inorganic mulches, and that's everything from rock, you know, gravel, to ground up tires that looks like organic mulch, whatever it is, they're kind of a necessary evil because those materials in and of themselves are not a good weed preventer. The rock is not a good weed preventer. It just doesn't create the barrier, okay? And what you're trying to do with mulch, and actually with weed control fabric too, but what you're trying to do is keep that weed seed from getting to mineral earth. That seed needs to be surrounded by mineral rich earth to germinate. And so by creating this mulch barrier, you are able to both keep moisture in and keep the weeds kind of up and easier to maintain. Now, it is a process. Mulching is a process. Mulching, it typically needs to be done annually. And you need to be aware of the depth of mulch that you have, and mulch because of need, not because of color, okay? I know a lot of people freshen up their mulch beds because they don't like the color of the old mulch. Really make sure that you are just maintaining an adequate 3-inch depth of organic mulch. And I wouldn't go over 3 inches deep over your entire planting area.
I have a question. What do you think about the mulch spray to, you know, revive the color?
Actually, so that's new to me. It's just starting in our area, and where they're going in and re-dyeing old mulch, basically. It's an interesting thought. I kind of like it as long as you know, I haven't really researched it enough to know what's in that spray. But I think it's kind of along the line of the dyed mulches, right? So the dyed brown, the dyed black, the dyed red, which never been a fan of the dyed red. Sorry if you like it, but it's personally, it's like, wow, look at my mulch. But it is, there was a lot of fear early on that the dyes that were used in that mulch would be toxic to plants. They're not actually. They are I guess from what I understand, a vegetable-based dye that actually does no harm, or does little harm anyway, to the soil. And I actually was a fan of that. I liked the dyed mulch because it prevented people from creating these, you know, volcanoes of death of mulch around trees, because people were just piling one layer of mulch on top of another because they liked the color of the new mulch, right? And so if you used a dyed mulch, maybe that color lasted just a little bit longer and kept people from over mulching. So overall, I do like the dyed mulches. And so, and that's basically, they're just coming up with another way to do that. It's kind of like spraying the color back on the old mulch.
Tim, we have another mulch question.
Yes.
Asking for, and a few others, I'll get to the others too, but on the subject of mulches, what are some of the organic mulches that you like to use? What's your favorites?
Yeah, well, actually what it boils down to is organic mulches are typically byproducts of whatever area you're in. And here in Missouri, we have a lot of, we have oak, hickory, pine forests, climax forests. We have a lot of forest products. And so we typically have a large amount of hardwood bark mulch, okay? And the reason why I like hardwood bark mulch is because it's cheap. And it's cheap because we have a lot of it. It's a byproduct, it's a waste product. If you are in other parts of the world, you might have rice hulls, you might have pine straw. Okay. Be honest with you, I like them all. I like them all. I like anything that is inexpensive, it is organic, and it can keep the moisture in and keep the weeds out. I'm not a big fan of importing different types of mulches. Like honestly, cypress mulch costs a lot more here because we don't know, it's not a byproduct. Pine straw costs a lot more where I'm at. I don't think it's necessary to buy pine straw. I know pine straw is kind of a requirement in some parts of the world because of termite issues that are prevalent. I know termites can be kept down by using like pine straw. However, I'd like to debunk one myth as well, that mulch does not typically, mulch in and of itself does not draw termites. Okay? It does not draw termites. A lot of people I've had in the past say they wanted to switch to rock because they didn't want termites in their house. So by putting my common sense cap on, I started looking into that. And first of all, if mulch brought in termites, every house that I've ever landscaped, or 99% of the houses that I've landscaped, would have termites. Okay, so there's that. Second, and this is a little bit more scientific, termites are not attracted to bark. Termites eat the cellulose wood, that wood that is beneath the bark. So they eat your 2x4s, they don't eat your mulch. Okay, so that's actually a fact on that. Now, where we run into problems with mulch is if you are buying mulch, the free mulch, and I honestly, I'm thrilled to death with the free mulch program, but typically free mulch is garden waste that has come into your municipality and been ground up and is now available for mulch. So you have ground pallets, you have ground cellulose wood chips, okay? That can actually be tasty to a termite. Where we get the biggest issues with termites, however, is improperly applied mulch. And that is, termites prefer to stay underground and they prefer access into your wood without having to cross through sunny, well-lit and airy areas. So if you can keep that mulch down below your siding, a couple of inches, you want to see concrete between the top of your mulch and the bottom of your siding. And it doesn't matter if you use rock, tires, or wood chip mulch, you can bring termites into your house if you put it down improperly, okay? So I'm not a huge fan of the wood chip mulch, but I do like shredded bark, and that's what I use here.
We have a few more questions while you're on mulch.
Sure, let's do it.
Okay, a question of, should you remove last year's mulch?
I remove last year's mulch only if there's a depth issue. If there is a depth issue. So I like to, again, maintain approximately, and I want to give you a range here, a 2 to 4 inch depth of mulch. I prefer to keep right around that 3-inch level, okay? If I have areas, and you know how everybody's landscape's a little bit different. I have areas in my landscape where the wind whips around and spirals a little bit and blows mulch, out of the bed and into the lawn, and I never see it again. Those areas are thinner. And so I may remulch those areas before I remulch areas that are up kind of protected from the wind or protected from erosion and are a little bit thicker. So I don't necessarily, I like my mulch to be uniform throughout. So I may take those thicker areas and either remove some of the mulch or spread it out in the thinner areas before I cover everything up with new.
Okay. A question about cedar mulch. Will that help repel bugs?
It can, actually it can. Kind of like your cedar closet helps, cedar lined closets kept moths out. So a lot of our garden pests are caterpillars, which are just juvenile moths. Okay, and so cedar mulch actually does have some pest resistance or some ability to, repel some of, primarily the insect-based pests.
Okay, and our last mulch question for now, is black mulch a concern in terms of overheating the soil and roots?
Yes, but not as much as, say, a rock mulch. Okay, the black mulch actually does have a tendency to absorb a little bit more heat, but it's minuscule when compared to like a dyed brown mulch. It's a very small amount as far as it goes. The bigger problem with heat in mulches is not necessarily that it warms the ground up during the day. It's really that, like with the rock, especially like on the west side of a house or south side, it's like an oven. So it heats that rock up, and then that rock doesn't cool down quickly. It just kind of radiates heat out. So the plants really never get a break, from the heat. Whereas even the black mulch, that mulch cools down a lot more quickly once the sun goes down.
Okay.
So it's not a major concern of mine. My biggest concern with black mulch is the consistency of being able to find it. Yeah, if you start with that, you kind of want to stay with that. And I know not as many areas around here anyway carry it.
We have a couple more questions in the chat box, but you may be getting to them in a little bit. So I'll just let you know what they are just as they come up. So one was about conditioning soil in a new garden bed. And the other was about getting rid of vines and ivy.
Okay. We'll just stay here on weed control for the vines and ivy.
Okay.
Unfortunately, vines and ivy, you have to be very diligent with this. If you want to avoid the use of chemicals, and that's an if on there, you're going to have to be far more thorough than most weeds when it comes to eradicating this digitally with your hands. If you leave bits and pieces behind, it's going to come back. Okay. Typically, this is where I will probably break into the chemical control if I'm trying to, especially if I'm trying to eradicate vines and ivy in an area. And I hate to, I'm never a big fan of promoting the use of pesticides. However, in this case, probably a brush killing herbicide is the best way to go. I know there's a lot of concern over the, Roundup being a carcinogen, so please be careful, but the Roundups that are designed for more of a brush or ivy control, I prefer to use that over a lot of other chemicals because once it hits the soil, it becomes inert. It's no longer active. Once it hits the soil, it won't leach out into other places. So you can spray it on the foliage of the ivy, and vines, and it will kill that, and then it does not leach into the soil. And so I prefer the Roundup products because of that over other like Post or like the Tordon type products. They will actually go through the root system and leach into other parts of the landscape. And then the other question was on bed prep, basically soil conditioning. Was that correct? Yes. So is that right? Okay. So I like for my planting areas to be consistent. I start off with like a 2/3, 1/3. And so what I do is I take the most organic available topsoil that I can buy in bulk, that we can buy in bulk. And I do that with a 2/3 of that topsoil. And then I add about 1/3 by volume of composted organics. And that can be manure, that can be your municipal compost, whatever it is, garden scrap type compost. But I like to add the organics in there because as the organics, we have a lot of clay soil. And as the organics decompose, it actually changes the structure of that soil to allow more water and nutrient, percolation and infiltration and percolation. And so I like to condition my soils that way. Is that the question? Does that answer it or?
I believe so. If that didn't, please go ahead and type any more specific question in the chat.
Yeah.
And one just came in. I've been tilling in chopped up leaves and compost. Is that
okay?
Just good?
No, that's actually good. Yeah, you are. Now here's the thing. anytime you incorporate organics into the soil, you are doing good. Okay, so you are incorporating organics. What you may run into, however, with old leaves, even barks, sawdust, things like that, is what they call a nitrogen lock. And so basically carbon lock. And so a high carbon organic material like woody stems, mulch, sawdust, leaves to some extent, the higher the carbon in there, it may actually tie up some of the nitrogen that's available. And so you don't want to go too heavy with that. It's actually probably best if you let a lot of those old leaves, pile them up somewhere and let them rot into a soil on their own. Otherwise, you may find yourself needing to add nitrogen fertilizer to the soil, because a lot of times the carbon that's in that will be attracted chemically to the nitrogen that's around there and lock it up and make it unavailable for the plants.
Tim, someone had a question. Is that, you mentioned no fertilizers in with the natives, but what about all this compost and organic matter?
Yeah, so that I actually do use organics. I don't put chemical fertilizer down. I remulch on an annual basis when I remember, and when I try to keep up with the remulching. And then also I will put typically down before I remulch, I will either, I'll stir up the mulch a little bit that's there, and I'll add some composted organic matter in, and then maybe mulch on top of that. The reason that I do that is it's really the same thing. It's just a slower process. By adding organics, the organics are not absorbed directly by plants. Organics have to decompose into minerals. Plants only uptake mineral forms of nutrients. Okay, so organic matter is not absorbed by plants. It's what organic matter becomes that is absorbed by plants. And so by adding organics back to the soil, it helps to replenish the nutrients that are being used by the plants throughout the season in a slower fashion. It's kind of like the ultimate slow release fertilizer, in that it takes the soil, the microbes have to break down the organic matter into mineral nutrients for the plants to absorb them.
Great. I'm going to let you continue on a little
Sure.
bit, and then we'll collect more questions.
Yeah, we're in good shape. We only have about 3 more hours of this talk. We're in spots. All right, so now how do we reduce irrigation? Irrigation is, all living things require water, right? All living things require water in here. And so we can talk about xeriscaping, and that's with an X, xeriscaping. I have students call it zero-scaping a lot, Z-E-R-O, but it's actually xeriscaping with an X. A lot of folks think xeriscaping is basically using succulents and cacti in the garden, and yuccas, and they don't like the plants. Well, really, that's kind of just part of it. Using water or low water need plants is part of it for sure, but also there are different facets of xeriscaping. It's basically just water management. It's managing your water. It's not overcrowding your beds. I've used that terminology before. More hogs at the trough, right? So if you got a water trough and the more pigs you have in there, the less amount of time that water is going to stay in that trough before you have to refill it. If you can keep your plant material to an adequate amount for the space that you have in your planting beds, you can control the need for supplemental irrigation. Okay? And the best way to do that, and this is coming at you from a designer's perspective, but if you actually draw a plan before you plant, you actually create these little circles, symbols, and you make them a size by scale as to what they will be when they grow up, not what they are when you plant them. Then you can ensure that you have an adequate spacing for the plants in your landscape beds. Now, what happens to us a lot of time is we plan to the mature size, and then we go out and we buy these things that are much less than even half that size. And we go home and we put them in the bed and we see all this empty space. And we think, well, I need to fill it up. I need more. I need to put more in there. It's called patience. So we have to understand that these plants will grow. And we also have to understand that some empty parts in the bed are okay, All right, so make sure you're not overcrowding your bed. Also, you want to plant drought resistant material. Again, you can find these lists, but plants that grow in a lack of water or drought tolerance are, a good place to start. I've also found that plants that have a full sun requirement, when you see that full sun on there, they use less water. They're used to be putting in environments where the sun is beating on them all the time. And so they tend to survive more with less supplemental irrigation. Likewise, on the flip side of that, your shade plants typically like a moist, consistently moist, rich, organic, shady environment. And especially if they're getting into more sun, may tend to need a little bit more water. Okay. You want to group your plants together with like water needs. It's called hydrozoning. Okay. So, you've got full sun plants and you've got shade plants. Well, they need to be separate in the garden. You need to put your full sun plants in places where you have sun and your shade plants where you have shade, and don't put them together. Okay. You can kill a juniper trying to keep a hydrangea alive, because the amount of water that it's going to take to keep that hydrangea going and turgid with, not wilted, and you're going to overwater that juniper and drown it. Okay, so you have to make sure that you're putting like water needs together. You also want to make sure that you use proper exposures. We talked about this already, but if you've got a hosta in the full sun, it's going to wilt. And as a gardener, our trigger reaction when we see wilted plants is to water it. Okay? We're trying to outwater a poor choice of location for that plant. Okay? And then again, I'm sorry, but reducing lawn area is a great way to reduce the amount of water that you have to need. Now, here's the thing. If you can have as much lawn as you want, as long as you get to the point where you understand that your lawn didn't die in the middle of July just because it turned brown. It went dormant. And most of us have cool season grasses that are designed to not be pretty, but to survive the hot months by turning brown. They shut down for a while. But if you allow it to cool off a little bit, get into September, that lawn will green back up. So where we run into issue, however, is we like to water our cool season grasses to be green year round. Okay? Now you can also switch to warm season grasses, but those run into their own, the zoysias, the Bermudas. If you plant Bermuda grasses along around here, you're going to have your neighbors up in arms. But in the more arid parts of the country, Bermuda grass is a welcomed turf lawn grass. Your zoysia grass, your buffalo grasses, things like that. They'll be green in the summer, but they just won't be green for, from late September into May. So you be happy with a brown lawn at some point, or water it. And that's what people do. They tend to pump water to their lawns in the summer months to keep them green.
We do have a question about lawns along those lines.
Yeah, sure, absolutely.
A question about clover in lawns, but I don't know if the question is weed control or the question is incorporating clover into lawns, which can be beneficial.
Well, let's talk about clover in the lawns for one. First of all, I'm an Ozark Mountain kid. And if it was green and you could mow it to the same height of everything else, where I grew up, it was a lawn, okay? And we had white clover all over, and we just mowed it off and called it grass. And then we went out and made really cool necklaces out of the white flowers, that would come up in there. I do understand, however, why some folks don't like clover in the lawn. There's a lot of beneficials to the clover. First of all, it's a nitrogen fixing plant. It actually helps improve the soil wherever it's at. And it actually has a tendency to come in naturally to areas of poorer soil. And so it will actually help improve that soil. And that's primarily a competition thing. If the soil was good, the fescue would be so thick that the clover couldn't grow there. But what happens is clover comes into an area, invades an area that has thinner amounts of turf because the soil is not necessarily as awesome as it should be. And it's working to fix that. So I actually don't have a problem with clover in a lawn. Also, if you talk to the honeybee people, they are a big fan of clover because it's an early spring bloomer. and you have a lot of hungry bees in the early parts of the year. And so even honestly, dandelions, which I know are a lawn enemy, are fantastic for bees as well. So overall, as far as controlling clover in your yard, I'll let you talk to the folks at Scott about that, but there's all kinds of broadleaf control that you can put out there along in conjunction with fertilizers. But as far as leaving it there, I'm not concerned. Again, I like a green lawn, but I don't care what's necessarily in it making it green. So there's that. And then organic mulch beds as a good way to reduce irrigation. You know, it's funny. I've lived in 2 homes since my wife and I have been married. The first one, I had an irrigation system that covered the lawn because we were in the middle of suburbia and everybody had a green lawn. And so we put an irrigation system so we could have a green lawn too. But I did not have those irrigation lines or heads or misters or even drip lines in my planting beds. They were not in the planting beds. Also, the house that I live in now, I have no supplemental irrigation system at all. I let my grass turn brown if it's going to turn brown in the summer. To be honest with you, that's a week or 2 I don't have to mow it, and I'm kind of cool with that. All right. I have never, since the first year of establishment, applied supplemental irrigation to my landscape beds. The primary reason for that is part of it was a little bit, I guess, academic. I wanted to see what would happen if I didn't. And in 2012, we had the worst drought that we've lived in that house since 2004, and that gave it 8 years before 2012. And 2012 hit, and it rained the entire month of April. Like it seemed like every other day. And then it did not rain again until, I think, if I remember right, it was late September. And I'm talking barely even 1/10 of an inch throughout that entire time. And so it took everything that I could not to water my landscape during that because I was just scared to death that it was going to die. But keep in mind, this was a landscape that had been established for 8 years at that point. I lost 3 plants. I lost 3 total plants, and those plants were dappled willow. Okay, dappled willow, which is a bit of a water-loving plant. Now, I say I lost 3. They looked like they were dead. I pulled them out and I threw them into a ditch on my property where one of them started to grow again in September. So it didn't actually even kill it. So the point being is we create a lot of our own issues with irrigation. By overwatering, we create irrigation dependent plants. Okay? We need to water in larger quantities less often. Increase the duration, decrease the frequency. Okay. What happened is I created self-sufficient plants. I shouldn't say that. I allowed my plants to become self-sufficient. I allowed my plants to develop deep roots because I didn't pump extra water to them on a daily or weekly basis. Okay. Now, if you're going to put an irrigation system in for ease of mind, or if you have a lot of plants that tend to be a little bit more water hungry, thirsty, I guess, then by all means put an irrigation system in, but click it off of automatic. Water it, go out and turn them on when they need water. Okay, hit the on button and the off button. Don't allow it to set up on a clock that waters regardless of soil moisture. Make sure that you are controlling the amount of water that's available, and your plants will be actually stronger because of it. And that goes for your lawns too, folks, actually. If you can water your lawn for an increased duration and not every day, your lawn roots will be a lot deeper and you will be able to survive prolonged periods without water. Okay. What I like to do is figure out what the irrigation system, how long it takes the irrigation system to apply the equivalent of 1 inch of rainfall to the landscape. Okay, so what you can do is you can place rain gauges out throughout your lawn and your garden and turn your system on and watch the clock. How long does it take for that system to produce the equivalent of 1 inch of rainfall? Then do that once a week. So if in 45 minutes running that system, you get an inch of rainfall, then run your system for 45 minutes once a week. And your plants will be much stronger because of it. All right, here we go. That's that clock, right? Most irrigation controllers run based on a schedule that you type in, you decide. Okay, it's done less by need and more by your own personal peace of mind and what you think the plants require. Now they're making a lot of headway and have made a lot of headway. And there are irrigation systems out there now that are actually linked, you know, through the internet, through Bluetooth or whatever it is they're doing, to weather stations. And they're also connected to soil probes. And you can actually have systems now that will only water how much is needed when it's needed. Now, granted, this comes with a little bit more cost up front, but it's tending to save people a lot of money as far as water goes later on, because these soil probes then send a message that this zone is dry, and it waters that zone until that zone is no longer dry. It also takes into account the humidity levels, transpiration rates, and the weather for your area, and will water accordingly. So watering by need rather than by a clock is a big deal when it comes to reducing your irrigation. So how do we reduce pruning? First of all, plan with proper spacing. One of the biggest reasons we cut pieces off of a plant is because we probably shouldn't have put it in that spot to start with. Okay, draw it out to as big as it will get. If on average your plant gets to be an 8-foot height and an 8-foot spread, do not try to make it work in a 4-foot wide planting bed, because at some point you're going to be cutting parts off that plant to make sure it's not overgrowing the area. Notice how we put that on the plant. We always say, oh, it overgrew. It's overgrown. The plant grew to how big the plant was going to get. We put it in a spot that allowed it to become overgrown. We put it in a spot that was insufficient for the size that plant typically gets. And we do that all the time. Gardeners do that all the time. We decide, hey, I'm a great gardener, I'll stay on top of it. You know? And the other thing I think is funny is when I hear people say, oh, I just cut my plant back to about half and it absolutely loved it, because you should have seen the new growth after that. Well, that has nothing to do with the plant. I mean, I think if you could actually poll plants and they said, hey, you know, how do you feel about pruning? I'm gonna bet most of them don't like it. That's my bet. You know, I don't want somebody to come in and take 2 or 3 inches off of my height every year. Okay. So what happens is then we have a root system that has developed to support an 8-foot plant. When we cut that plant back down to about a 4-foot height, then we now have a root system that is absorbing enough material and pushing it into the plant that is now half the size. That's why you get this rapid bud elongation. So once you open up that can of worms of pruning, you pretty much are going to stay in that room. You're going to continue to have a pruning nightmare as you go on. You don't want to overcrowd your beds. You have to plan for mature size. You also need to make sure you don't end up with this, right? Your landscape is supposed to enhance the architecture, not hide it, okay? So we end up, you know, not understanding the full mature size of our plants creates more work for us. Okay? So make sure that, you know, it's not an exact science. They usually give us a range though, right? They give us a range of how big a plant will get, and make sure that we give it at least that much room. And I say at least that much room because plant tags lie. Whoever writes the information on a plant tag, they have a tendency to try to appeal to those of us who like smaller plants. And what's happening is the industry has noticed throughout time that the amount of space that people have to garden has reduced. Now, if you notice the cultivars that are out there, how many dwarf cultivars have been happening of plants that were considerably larger? You know, we have our dwarf quince, we have our dwarf forsythia, we have our dwarf barberry, we have, you know, plants that once upon a time were much larger. Well, that's because we have less space. We have less space and we still like the variety of the plants. And so, you know, when I say we have less space, a lot fewer people now live on a 100-acre farm than live in a 1/4-acre lot. Okay, so we have less room to play. And so we want to get as much variety in there as we can. And so we like smaller plants. And so most plant tags will probably only give you about 80% of that plant's true growth potential, maybe even less. When the knockout rose first came out, it was advertised as a 3 foot by 3 foot mounding shrub. The roses I put in the landscape grew 3 foot a year. I mean, it was amazing, the growth on those plants. So, you know, I would, if I was planting knockout roses now, I would give them 6 to 8 feet of height and spread. We also need to keep in the height of our material. You know, this is an issue I've seen far too many times. The investment in that beautiful Colorado blue spruce is actually a waste at this point, because when they put that in the ground, I guarantee you it was probably about a 3 to 4 foot tall blue spruce. And they thought it had plenty of room, but then they didn't take into account the growth. And now you have a foliage fighting with gutter and eave situation. And there's really not a whole lot you can do as far as pruning is concerned with this plant to keep that at bay, or at least to recover at this point. And so, you know, you're forced with a situation where you actually technically need to cut that plant off at the ground and start over with something that either will not get that tall or is out a little bit further away from the house. Again, planting in proper exposures. You know, we have a tendency, if our plants are full sun and we put them in some shade, they get that, you know, the term is leggy, I hear a lot, but they elongate, the vegetation elongates. And so they try to make their lilac bush a little bit more bushy. And so you go through and you cut back the meristematic tips, and that forces the axillary buds to push out, and they make a fuller plant. And so by making our plants look like we want them to, it creates a little bit more pruning. And then again, organic mulch. And actually I tried really hard, but I'm just kidding. I couldn't come up with any reason why mulch, how it could reduce pruning. So I put it on every other slide. So I thought I should put it on this one too. So. All right, then how do we reduce mowing? Okay, now this is, you know, because one of the things, you know, honestly, another common theme besides mulch was reduction of lawn area, okay? So one of the ways to do that is if you have a large area property, maybe, and I know this sounds odd, but because a lot of people give me a funny look when I say, make bigger planting beds, okay? And my philosophy on that has always been that you remulch planting beds once a year, you mow once a week, okay? And so that's a thought process. Now there is another thought process that comes in, and that is I remulch my own landscape, but somebody else mows for me, okay? So if that's the case, then obviously, you know, more lawn is probably less maintenance for you. But I like to use large, swoopy mulch beds. And when I say large and swoopy, I like those curved lines to be broad enough. I am not a fan of string trimmers. I don't like using them. And so if I can stay on my mower, or I can not use a string trimmer, I'm a happy person. And so I try to create, you know, areas that don't have sharp angles. I don't like tight spaces where I can't turn. I like to be able to put my mower deck on the outside of that bed and blow the opposite direction and just drive along the edge of it. And that helps keep my maintenance down. I also prefer not to have the hardscape bed edges, okay? I prefer not to have something rigid trying to corral the mulch in with, keep it out of the lawn and vice versa. The reason for that is I can't put my mower deck on that line of rocks right there and mow. I have to string trim that to keep the grass down so that you can see that. I think it's attractive. I don't have an issue with a rock lined or brick lined bed. I like that, but it is setting me up for a situation where I have to operate a string trimmer. And so I'm not a big fan. What I prefer actually is what they call the V trench. So I like to trench, and that gives us about a 3 to 4 inches more depth of mulch right at the bed edge that allows me to maintain that edge with a mower rather than coming through with a string bed. Also, think about different varieties. You know, you've got your buffalo grass or maybe ground cover, you know, so different varieties of lawn. It doesn't have to be mowed as often, or replacing some turf with living ground covers. Big fan of this actually, because it still gives me, what I like about a lawn is I like a it's not a visual impact. Okay, it's not a vertical element of the landscape. In fact, it is low, it is flat, it is negative space. You can look over the top of it, and you can do that with ground covers as well. And so replacing either changing up the turf variety or replacing turf with ground covers is a good way to go. To I don't lose the effect that I had with the turf. I still have that low green carpet, but I have it in something that doesn't have to be mowed on a regular basis. Now, I will caution you a little bit. We back up here and we look at like the buffalo grass and lawn here. Make sure you're in the right environment for that. We tried it in Missouri. It didn't work real well overall. Kansans tend to have, your short prairie areas. This is a great grass. However, what happened here was a little bit of a misconception of what was actually being sold. And that everybody thought that a grass that you only had to mow once a year meant that it still looked like a lawn that was mowed every week, and it doesn't. You don't get the cool striping effect. You don't get the even grass. Buffalo grass does not grow all at the same height. It just doesn't grow real tall. And so a lot of times what we ended up with was what you see here is like, it looks like a lawn that maybe needs to be cut. And so public perception kind of dealt the buffalo grass lawn a hard blow. Plus we're not exactly the right climate for it here in Missouri. Further west you go, the better off you're going to be on that. And then increase your naturalized or native areas. And I use those, I put that slash in between. Native is great, but naturalized is also okay if you don't have it. But like embrace the unmanaged, embrace the let it be philosophy. If you are into that and can find the beauty in that, then I say more power to you. I have a large portion of my property is actually, it's former pasture, which by not mowing it becomes a hay field. And actually there are times just before we have a local farmer come in and take the hay off, and just before they do that, when that wind blows across that hay field and you get those amber waves of grain that you hear about in the song, it's absolutely beautiful. And so honestly, if it weren't for the fact that it would be full of calorie pear seedlings and eastern red cedar, I probably wouldn't have them mow it at all. But that helps maintain some of those woody stemmed invaders out of there. So I love the idea of naturalized areas. Just let it be, right? Just let it be. But again, that kind of depends on your neighborhood, your neighbors, your own perception of what beauty is. But I love the look of, and also the variety. Honestly, a field full of just fescue tops is not all that gorgeous, but if you've got a mix of grass in there, yeah, it can be fantastic. So it's a lot of fun. Plus, every now and then some fun flowers come up in there. We get a lot of native oxeye daisy coming up in our hayfield, which is also quite a bit of fun to look at before they cut it. So looks great. And then transplanting and replanting. And actually, this is gonna be like a dagger to the heart of a lot of master gardeners right here, because this is a lot of what we like to do. This is a lot of the fun that comes in, but that transitional area of the landscape where we dig something up and move it somewhere else, or we get something from a friend at a meeting and we take it home and put it in our yard. But our seasonal color areas, and I say that that's typically annuals. Reducing those tends to reduce our maintenance. In there, you want to, the annuals are nutrient hogs, they're water hogs, they're beautiful, they're fantastic, but then again, you got to weigh the cost versus the benefit, or the cost versus the benefits on that. I like to use seasonal color, and I like to use seasonal color in the landscape, but I prefer to keep my seasonal color confined to containers. I'm not a big fan of using seasonal color in the actual planting beds. A couple of reasons for that. One is a lot of times the amount of water that's going to go into keeping those looking good could be detrimental to the rest of the plants. Also, I can control my soil here. In a container, I can control the soil, the fertilization, the watering a lot easier than I can putting them in beds. And now I like annual color in my landscape beds, but I've developed an affinity for putting containers randomly throughout my landscape beds and having those full of annuals. Also like you to be careful with your herbaceous perennials. A lot of people think I go herbaceous perennials, I've cut my maintenance way down. Well, there are some issues. There are a lot of issues with herbaceous. For one, we've already talked about, and that is self-seeding. You know, these plants can kind of grow and overtake areas. Also, if you look at your grasses that are in that, you know, you have some invasiveness with grasses. You also have, by nature, these herbaceous perennials will spread. That's their job. And so to keep that in check becomes somewhat of your job. Okay? Limit the use of spreading material overall. This is actually an ITEA. This is, so, you know, it's not just confined to the herbaceous. Know what your woody stem plants will do as well. What is their nature? You know, the more you try to prevent a plant from doing what naturally comes to it, the more likely you are to create maintenance for yourself. So if you have a planting, if you decide to put a whole bunch of really nice ITEA in the ground and you want them to stay as individual plants, know that you're going to be able to do a lot of work to maintain that look. Now, if you understand that ITEA is a massing shrub and that it's meant to grow together, then let it do so. And just appreciate what it does and use it accordingly. Also, your design style will affect your maintenance. Informal, contemporary, cottage garden style, natural, they're more loose, right? And so when you have a more loose approach to your landscape and garden, you have a lower expectation for maintenance. Whereas your formal or classical types, you know, if you look here, you have a formal in the upper left and you have a less formal, more loose in the lower right. You know, of the two gardens that I'm looking at right there, I would probably rather be in charge of maintaining the one on the lower right. And it's not so much that there aren't maintenance concerns. There's actually maintenance concerns in both of those. However, if a weed should happen to come up in that garden on the lower right, it could actually stay there for a while without raising too many red flags. Wouldn't set off any alarms. But on the upper left, if you have a weed come up in the middle of that lattice work over there, somebody's going to know it really fast. Okay, so you have to stay on top of and be more diligent if you have a more formal style landscape. Water features in the garden, love them. This is one of those things where the benefits come into play because if you enjoy what a water feature does for you in your landscape, waterfalls, streams, ponds, things like that, then you're going to be a little bit more tolerant of the maintenance, but these tend to be higher maintenance features in the garden more so than others. You have to maintain your water level. Most of us work really hard at staying on top of algae. Apparently we do not like green water in our water features. We also have some winter concerns. What do we do with our fish? What about ice? What about the pump? You know, what happens on that? And then do we do a pond? Do we do pondless? You know, there's basically what it boils down to is a pondless water feature, probably less maintenance than one with ponds. However, there's still maintenance. So this is one of those where if you don't want to take care of it later, don't put one in now, okay? Because it is going to take some work on that. All right, so reconsider your extra effort plants, okay? Try to avoid planting plants that are marginally hardy. Now this is again, I'm stabbing a dagger into the hearts of master gardeners because we all feel like that those rules are for everybody else, that we're good enough gardeners that we can make it work anywhere, right? Sure, it'll be a challenge, but I love a challenge, okay? But the point is, to make a plant do what it doesn't want to do requires extra effort, okay? Also, I'm not a big fan of plants that require extra support. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm a big fan of a peony, but I let it flop. Okay, if it's gonna flop, I'm gonna let it flop. Or I'll pick a variety that tends not to flop, okay? I always called them plant prisons when I was younger. I don't like seeing plants that are in prison cages to keep them upright. If you don't want it to flop, don't plant it because it's a flopper. I also saw people that worked so hard to keep deer away from their roses that they couldn't even see them. You know, they put their roses behind a fence that keeps a deer out and then you can't see them. So I tend to avoid plants that require extra support or protection, okay? Like right here, what you see, yeah, I get it. If you have an orchard, put a fence around your apple trees. But if it's in your yard and I have to put, you know, 6 T-posts and a roll of chicken wire around my trees in my landscape to protect them, I probably need to pick a different tree. Because what happens then is the aesthetics of that tree is already minimalized by the amount of protection that I have to put on it and around it. And then plants that cannot handle the great outdoors. Anything that you think you have to dig up and bring in the wintertime and put back out in the spring is already off of Moloney's list. I'm not going to do it. If you can't handle the winter where I plant you, you're going to die in the winter and I'll plant something else next spring. And that's me. I also am not a big fan of running out before frost and covering everything up in sheets and plastic and all that kind of stuff. If it can't handle it where I'm at, I don't plant it. Okay, and I know I'm speaking directly to a lot of you right now, and you watch those frost warnings in the spring and the fall, and you're scared, and you've got your sheets ready, and you're ready to come out there and make a tent over your plants, and that's okay if you want to do that work, but you're going to have to continue to do that work when you're not going to want to do it. Okay, personally, I am a big fan of any plant that can handle itself outside without my help. Okay, and then plants that need a beautician. Also not a big fan of plants that need a beautician. I am not into the amount of time that I have to invest to keep these meatballs looking like meatballs, okay? I am such a fan of the way this garden looks right here. I think it's fantastic, but I wouldn't even know how to begin to maintain this garden. And I know what it would look like if I was in charge of it, okay? And it would not look anywhere near as good. I appreciate the amount of work that goes into this garden. I'm just not going to be one that wants to do it. Okay. And so then we also have this. I actually really appreciate the humor more in this one than anything else. But all of this kind of extra work, plants that need a beautician don't come into my landscape. Now I will say that this right here is something that being a Moloney, I've been entertaining the Celtic knot garden for a long time in my mind, but I always go back to those previous pictures and I go, I know what this knot garden is going to look like. It's going to look like it's not a garden by the time that I'm done with it. So I just admire other people's efforts when it comes to this kind of extra work on there. So in a nutshell, what we're talking about is reducing your energy, okay? Reducing the amount of energy. And here's a good task. Right now, you're able, you're willing, you have the ability to do the work. But it's a good idea to start keeping a log as to how much work you're actually putting into your landscape now. And then look ahead, okay? Evaluate your current tasks and ask yourself, is this going to create extra work for me in the future? And if you say no, by the way, you're lying to yourself, okay? Because you know it is. The answer is likely yes. And then you decide if you foresee having the ability to continue with that work in 5, 10, 15, or even 20 years. If the answer to that, and it probably should be no, is no, then start taking steps now to kind of reduce some of your maintenance needs, okay? So to do so, how do you reduce? Evaluate everything that's in your garden. Evaluate everything that's in your landscape. Evaluate specifically every task that you're doing and decide whether or not it's worth it. Somewhere along the line, I decided that my cannas were not worth me digging them up every spring or every winter and putting them back out every spring. The amount of joy I got from the cannas did not equal the amount of work that I was putting into it. So cannas got taken off the list, okay? The rose bushes, the rose garden, the hybrid tea garden that I thought would be absolutely fantastic. I thought a guy with my kind of plant skills should have a hybrid tea garden, okay? The amount of time and effort it took to keep the deer from eating those swollen blooms before I got to enjoy them, and the amount of protection it was going to require, it wasn't worth it. So I got my enjoyment from plants that required less work, less input. I know I sound lazy, but I'm not a lazy person. I've just learned to weigh the benefits versus the cost. And part of that comes from being busy. You know, here's a project right here. Let's say this is actually very similar to a project that I was on, where we had some existing trees, which you can see, you know, scattered throughout the yard. You have a driveway coming in, front door. They wanted a larger patio, and they wanted to reduce maintenance, okay? And so what we decided to do is first concentrate on the patio and then develop. Notice right there off the bat, that's your bed lines, okay? Immediately, I have cut the lawn in half, at least. So let's go back one. So there's open lawn. This is what you had. This was the landscape before. All of that mowing. So whoops, going the wrong way now. All that mowing. Then I'm adding the patio, cutting out that lawn, adding the beds, at least 50% of the mowing went away. That's a lot of maintenance. When you reduce your turf areas that much by up to 50%, then you've reduced 50% of the mowing, you've reduced 50% of the fertilizer and the water. Okay. Next up, I just place my plants in and around, create my plant community. There's ground covers growing in where they were having issues with lawn before. And that, believe it or not, even though it looks like it is a lot more work, it's actually a lot less work. Predominantly, you know, you can pick your plants for being natives, you can pick your plants for the ground covers and keeping the weeds down. You can pick your plants to be resistant. You choose your plants well and add plantings.
Well, we've got new ones. I haven't looked at them. I just don't want two in them.
I'm with you. So then, a lot of people think if they have to simplify, they're going to make their landscape more boring, less attractive. Well, that's not the case, okay? Simple does not equal boring, okay? These are simple landscapes that are absolutely striking to look at. Nice big curves that are easy to mow around. Heavy plantings, lots of plant variety, but these plants thrive on their own without a lot of extra work. Simple, not boring. Allowing a large area of what was lawn be natural. Let it grow. That's all I've got for today. Appreciate your time, and I'll answer as many questions as you've got.